COVID-19 unleashed a wave of death, disease, and despair that shattered the lives and dreams of millions suffering from hunger, poverty, and mental illness. The shaky foundation our modern world is built upon is on the brink of economic and social collapse. But that's not all. The pandemic also sparked a series of other crises, such as inflation, which erodes the purchasing power of people and makes everything more expensive; job market turmoil, which leaves millions of workers unemployed, underemployed, or insecure; political polarization, which fuels hatred, violence, and extremism among different groups and ideologies; global supply chain destabilization, which disrupts the flow of goods and services and creates shortages, delays, and increased costs of everything; and rising global tensions overall, which increase the risk of conflicts and wars among nations and regions across the globe. Inflation is the general increase in the prices of goods and services over time. Inflation has become worse in the last 3 years due to several factors. The pandemic, which caused both supply and demand shocks to the economy, leading to higher prices of goods and services. The government also increased its spending to provide stimulus and relief to the affected sectors and households, which boosted the money supply and consumer demand. The energy crisis. The global energy market faced a supply crunch in 2022 due to geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, and underinvestment in production. This pushed up the prices of oil and gas, which affected many other industries that rely on energy as an input. Disrupted supply chains. The pandemic caused many disruptions in the production and distribution of goods, such as shortages of computer chips, raw materials, and labor. This reduced the supply of goods and increased their cost, which were passed on to consumers. The public's perception of future inflation can influence their current behavior, such as spending, saving, and bargaining. As inflation rose, people expected it to continue or worsen, which led them to demand higher wages and prices, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The price of gasoline increased by 50% over the past year due to rising demand and constrained supply. The oil market was also disrupted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, which pushed up the price of crude oil. The cost of shipping and logistics rose by 21% over the past year due to higher fuel prices, congestion of ports, and labor shortages. This affected many industries that rely on transportation, such as manufacturing, retail, and e-commerce. Food. The price of food increased by 12.5% over the past year due to higher cost of agricultural commodities such as corn, wheat, and soybeans. The pandemic also affected the processing and distribution of food, leading to shortages and higher prices of meat, dairy, and eggs. The COVID-19 pandemic had a profound impact on the labor market as well, causing widespread job losses and changes in work dynamics. Here's a brief summary of some of the main effects. Job losses. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, non-farm payroll employment in the United States declined by 9.4 million in 2020, the largest calendar year decline in the history of the series. The job losses were concentrated in industries that involve close contact with people, such as leisure and hospitality, transportation, warehousing, and food services. The unemployment rate peaked at 14.8% in April 2020, the highest level since the Great Depression, and remained elevated at 6.7% in December 2020. The pandemic also altered the way people worked, such as location, hours, and conditions of work. One of the most notable changes was the rise of remote work, as many workers shifted to working from home to reduce the risk of infection. According to a survey by McKinsey, the share of remote workers in the United States increased from 20% before the pandemic to 80% during the pandemic. Remote work also enabled more flexibility in work hours and schedules, but also posed challenges such as communication, collaboration, and productivity. Another change in work dynamics was the increased frequency of contact with others during in-person work, especially for essential workers who had to interact with customers, patients, or coworkers. This increased the exposure to the virus and the need for protective measures such as masks, gloves, and social distancing. Governments around the world reacted to the crisis in different ways depending on the nature, severity, and timing of the shock, as well as their pre-existing conditions, capacities, and preferences. Many governments increased spending and reduced taxes to support aggregate demand, provide relief to affected sectors and households, and finance health and social protection services. The size and composition of fiscal packages varied across countries, reflecting differences in fiscal space, borrowing costs, and policy priorities. Many central banks cut interest rates, expanded their balance sheets, and provided liquidity and credit support to financial markets and institutions. Some also engaged in unconventional policies such as quantitative easing, forward guidance, and negative interest rates. These actions aim to lower borrowing costs, stabilize financial conditions, and stimulate economic activity. The long-term consequences of these policy decisions are only recently being felt. The scarring effects on potential growth, inequality, and debt sustainability has started to become more apparent with time. The pandemic also exposed and exacerbated the existing political divides in many countries, especially in the United States, where partisanship has influenced the attitudes and behaviors of individuals and governments regarding the virus. Public opinions on leadership during the pandemic have varied depending on the performance and communication of the leaders, as well as the expectations and preferences of the public. According to a Pew Research Center report, Americans were more ideologically divided than any of the 19 other publics surveyed when asked how much they trust in scientists and whether scientists make decisions solely based on facts. The report also found that no country was as politically divided over its government's handling of the outbreak as the US was in a 14-nation survey last summer. The partisan gap in the US over whether the coronavirus is a major threat to public health was 40 percentage points in August 2020, compared with a median of 14 points across the other countries. Global supply chains are the networks of production, distribution, and consumption that span across countries and regions. They involve the coordination of multiple actors such as suppliers, manufacturers, retailers, and consumers, as well as the flow of goods, services, information, and money. Global supply chains have become more complex and interdependent over time as firms seek to reduce costs, increase efficiency, and access new markets. Lockdowns and restrictions. Many countries imposed lockdowns and restrictions to contain the spread of the virus, which hampered the movement of people, goods, and services. This resulted in factory closures, transport delays, border bottlenecks, and labor shortages, affecting the availability and quality of inputs and outputs. For example, the global shortage of semiconductors, which are essential components for many industries such as automotive, electronics, and telecommunications, has been partly attributed to the lockdowns in major producing countries such as China, Taiwan, and South Korea. The pandemic also caused significant shifts in consumer preferences and behavior, as people reduced their spending on non-essential goods and services such as travel, tourism, and entertainment, and increased their demand for essential and online goods and services such as health, food, and e-commerce. This created imbalances and mismatches between supply and demand, leading to shortages, surpluses, and price volatility. For instance, the surge in online shopping and home delivery during the pandemic increased the demand for cardboard boxes, which outstripped the supply of recycled paper, the main raw material for making boxes in the first place. Protectionism and nationalism. The pandemic also heightened the geopolitical and economic tensions between countries, as some resorted to protectionist and nationalist measures to secure their domestic supplies of critical goods, such as medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and vaccines. This undermined the principles of free trade and global cooperation and created uncertainty and instability in the global trading system. For example, the European Union imposed export controls on vaccines produced within its territory in response to the delays and shortfalls in vaccine deliveries from some manufacturers. The consequences of heavily relying on international production are both positive and negative. On the one hand, international production can offer benefits such as lower costs, higher quality, greater variety, and faster innovation by exploiting the comparative advantages, economies of scale, and learning effects on different countries and regions. On the other hand, international production also entails risks such as higher vulnerability, lower resilience, and lower sovereignty by increasing the exposure, dependence, and complexity of global supply chains. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated these trade-offs and has prompted many firms and governments to rethink and restructure their global supply chains by adopting strategies such as diversification, localization, digitalization, and collaboration. The role of COVID-19 in global supply chains has been and continues to be significant and transformative. The pandemic has not only disrupted the normal functioning of global supply chains, but has also accelerated the pre-existing trends and challenges such as the rise of Industry 4.0, the US-China trade war, and the environmental and social sustainability issues. COVID-19 has been the greatest calamity of our time so far. It has unleashed a wave of death and destruction that has shaken the world to its core. The pandemic also claimed over 5 million lives and disrupted the livelihoods of billions more. It has also sparked or worsened conflicts and chaos in many regions from the Middle East to Latin America, undermining peace and security. Moreover, it has triggered economic and social crises that have deepened poverty, inequality, and social unrest across the board.